Yale built Battelle Chapel, that massive, great structure. It opened in 1876, the year of this disputed election we're going to discuss. It reinforced its science schools, the Sheffield School and one other. There was a sort of surgence of what today we would call STEM learning. They didn't call it that then, of course. The president during the Reconstruction years, up until the second Timothy Dwight, who doesn't come till the 1880s, was one Noah Porter. Now, Noah Porter made the best effort he possibly could to keep Yale the good conservative college that it was. And I don't use that in any pejorative term here. Yale was about conserving curriculum, conserving social order, conserving the way young men had been educated at the best schools. Yale was still the largest college in North America, although the numbers start to be competitive between Yale and Harvard and Princeton and soon the state universities, many of which were founded, of course, a couple in the early 19th century, like UVA, but in the middle of the 19th century in places like Michigan and North Carolina and many other places. The theory of education at Yale, for better or worse, gained the reputation of being conservative. And there was a standard and a reputation to sustain, especially in the mind of a Noah Porter, who was a deeply instinctually conservative man. He never wanted to give up the teaching of Greek. A lot of the faculty did. Students did. Like, why are we learning Greek anymore? Doing recitations on it in the mornings? Come on. Porter said, no, it's the basis, and he wanted Latin there too, of course, the basis of language. And in parts of the Yale curriculum, it was essentially about language and science in this new scientific world. The Yale theory of education, according to one of its critics, actually a later historian critic, said this: it operated in these years, 1870s, 80s, into the 90s, it operated on the assumption that the better part of a college education was a training for good habits. Habits of worship, of devotion, habits of industry, exactness of study, which still meant memorization, good moral and physical habits. College is always kind of at war with that, isn't it? Habits of square and manly dealing. Now, the one major that began to really increase in these years, no surprise, folks, it's the Gilded Age. Well, it wasn't a major. You couldn't major in it, but when young men graduated from Yale, the numbers began to grow up and then kind of skyrocket by the 90s. They went into business. Habits for business. Now, there were critics of all of this, especially on the faculty, and Yale was undergoing what so many colleges undergo, decade after decade, generation after generation. Change, new kinds of learning. What's really new in the late 19th century or mid and late 19th century? The social sciences, of which history was often trying to be a part of. History in these years really wanted to be a science on the German model. You find the facts, you assemble them, you organize them, and you write them up. In retrospect, one of the greatest social scientists at Yale was William Graham Sumner. Now, Ingram Sumner has a mixed reputation now, has for many, 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 many years. He's one of the prophets of social Darwinism, which in its prime in the late 19th and early 20th century was a dominant point of view. This was the idea of applying somehow the origin of species it was a misuse of Darwin, but who cares? Applying the idea of the survival of the fittest to social interactions. People compete, some win, and some don't. And Sumner famously, he said a lot of other things, but unfortunately he's primarily famous for saying, those who can knock down the most persimmons will rule. I mean, God. Not his greatest metaphor, but he had insight into university curriculum and faculty. He was leading a kind of complaining caucus, let's call it that, and all faculties have them, don't they? Some of them just bark a lot, some of them get themselves elected to something, and some of them just, I don't know, stay quiet and teach. Teaching even fell into some disregard in the late 19th century. And that's a long story, and I don't know that I fully understand it, except in this age there was an attitude among a lot of faculty here and elsewhere that they were really shaping young men for the world, and the subject matter, Now, that's hard to imagine that people who devote their lives to a subject would even think that. But teaching actually wasn't that highly rewarded. But here's what William Graham Sumner said in a published essay in the early 1880s, complaining about the faculty. Stuck his neck out here. The piece was entitled, "Our Colleges Before the Country." He said that officers in the college are for many reasons unfit for college management. There's, I guess, talking about administrators. They are exposed to all pitfalls of every pedagogue. They have to guard themselves against the vices of dogmatism, pedantry, hatred of contradiction, conceit, and love of authority, which means they got to manage faculty. They, of course, come each to love, faculty now, his own pursuit beyond anything else on earth. Each thinks that a man who is ignorant of his specialty is a barbarian. I'm afraid that still rings true, folks. You haven't read X? Oh my God, you're not educated. You haven't read Y either? Who hired you? A man goes on in life under this discipline. As he goes on in life under this discipline, he becomes more self-satisfied and egotistical. He has little contact with active life. He gets few knocks, is rarely forced into a fight or into a problem of diplomacy, gets to hate care or interruption, and loves routine. Yeah? That's called tenure. Men of this type, of course, are timid, and even those traits which are most admirable in the teacher become vices in the executive officer. Such men are always overfond of a priori reasoning and fall helpless the moment they have to face a practical undertaking. Every sentence in this long quote takes me to memories of department meetings. They have a whole philosophy of heaven and earth reduced, measured out, and done up in powders to be prescribed at need. They know just what ought to be studied, in what amount, and succession of doses. Have some powder. That is to say, They are prepared to do any amount of mischief at a juncture when the broadest statesmanship is needed to guide and develop a great institution. In other words, we're selfish. We care about what we do. I do. And then Sumner concludes, certainly of course he did this to himself. He wanted everybody to become a sociologist. Certainly the notion that any body of men can now regulate the studies of youth by what was good for themselves 20, 40, or 60 years ago is one which is calculated to ruin any institution which they control. This is brutal. It is always a hard test of the stuff men are made of when they are asked to admit that a subject of which they have had control would profit by being taken out of their control and entrusted to liberty. Woo! Some things are new and some things are not. It was a fascinating place in the mid to late 19th century, growing, trying to feel its way into the great age of science. It will do that, but it's also finding its way into containing a lot of, let's just call it ideas of liberalism coming from a more liberal democratic world, greatly changing America because of massive immigration and massive industrialization and racial conflict. And Yale is trying to sustain its bubble. And sometimes, we still are. Although, the good news, of course, is that Yale has become this fantastic, almost incomprehensible place of learning everything. Everything gets studied here now. Everything. We all want to fight about that should be more of what I do and not more of what you do, of course. This division wants this and that division wants that. I remember once sitting at a dinner at Peter Salovey's house, a bunch of faculty. I'm sitting next, you ask each other. It was mostly science people. I have no idea what I was doing there. And the guy next to me asked me, what do I teach American history. He said, oh, that's interesting. I once liked history. But then I said, so what do you do? He says, I run the robotics lab. I said, something stupid, like, what's that? He said, we make robots. Well, of course you do, yeah. I was saved, though, because Peter clicked his glass and had a speech to make, so I didn't have to continue to show my ignorance. I didn't even know Yale had a robotics lab. But it does. It may have a robotics department now, I don't know. Now, a quick little, I feel like I'm reading from scripture here or something. I'm not. It's Sinclair Lewis, for God's sake. He wouldn't allow that to be called scripture. But in the book you're about to read, or are reading, there are some, priceless passages. This is another of my favorites. You know, the totalitarian, the authoritarian, Buzz Windrip has been elected. He's president-elect and coming to power. And poor old Doremus, our newspaper editor up in Vermont, he's just lost. He doesn't know what to do anymore. So one of the things he's trying, remember I quoted earlier about how he would escape somewhere to read books. He also escaped to his attic. He became a man in his attic. Anybody doing that already? Basement, attic, garage. Doremus's attic study had been to him a refuge for the tender solicitudes from Emma and the children and so on and so on. And it goes on. It was a refuge now from the considerably less tender solicitudes of supporters of the president-elect. Doremus is trying to block himself away from all the people who supported the authoritarian. He calls what's going on outside his home, American society, the revolt against civilization. Then he says, but the biggest trouble are all these utopians, the communists, the fascists, and there's the group defending democracy. He says they're all becoming utopians. They all have a theory for the perfect world. And by the way, fascism is a theory of a perfect world. You just better be on the right side. He says, the problem is I have to be in favor of one of these. And he says, I'm not in favor of any of them. We can, says Doremus, he's just talking to himself. We can go back to the Dark Ages. The crust of learning and good manners and tolerance is so thin. That's a sentence. The crust is so thin. You can break it. It would just take a few thousand big shells and gas bombs to wipe out all the eager young men and all the libraries and historical archives and patent offices, the stuff of learning, all the laboratories and art galleries, all the castles and the Periclean temples and Gothic cathedrals. He's imagining the end of civilization. All the cooperative stores and the motor factories, every storehouse of learning. No inherent reason for this, except he worries that his daughter will grow up and live in a cave and throw rocks at catamounts. It gets worse. That passage is on page 110 to 112. I urge you, go in and mark it. And if you already, one of you already told me you're having nightmares from reading this book, well, good luck. Now, the context of what's going to happen in that disputed election of 1876, a great and pivotal election, are many. The scandals of the Grant years, and I'll say a few words about three of them at least in just a minute. There are, so many elements of industrial capitalism that is booming in America at this time. And of course, it booms and crashes with the Panic of 1873 that I talked about the other day. Between 1865, get this, between 1865, the end of the war, and 1873, the Panic, 3 million new immigrants arrived in the United States. Some of you are probably descended from that immigration. Those numbers will continue to grow and grow and grow. Most settled in cities in the industrial Northeast, but not all. Many went west. The post-war industrial production in those 8 years increased 75%. Imagine an 8-year period now where production in this country would increase 75%. For the first time, by the mid-1870s, non-agricultural workers outnumbered farmers, and wage earners outnumbered independent craftsmen. The majority now, and increasing in numbers, only make a living by working for somebody else for wages. And if you do that, you're at the mercy of an economy, usually, more than you are as an independent laborer. By 1873, only Britain's industrial output was greater than the United States, and the U.S. was catching up. U.S. government policies fostered all this. Republican policies. Prime the pump. Energetic government. With high tariffs. Very low taxes. And no income tax. The other day, did you hear the quote from whoever the person is that former president nominated to be Secretary of Commerce, he said, we need to go back to 1900. He said it when we had no income tax. And man, he got cheers from the... I mean, I don't know the level of ignorance you have to have in that setting to think that's a good idea. But we're in a brave or terrifying new world. Federal government gave open support and piles of money to railroad entrepreneurs, subsidies. Between 1865 and 1873, 35,000 new miles of railroad were laid in this country. And railroads were the future of commerce, the future of the economy, the future of wealth. They were General Motors, they were Silicon Valley, they were it for now. In fact, the mileage of track in America by the mid-1870s was more than the entire mileage in the country in 1860. That didn't make sense. The increase was more than the total, sorry. And railroad building became what fueled Wall Street. The way Cornelius Vanderbilt became the king of Wall Street was through, in effect, all but monopolizing transportation. He did it first through steamers and by sea and by rivers, but then he did it through railroads. Although he's going to get outdistanced by Tom Scott in the Pennsylvania Railroad when it became the largest corporation in the United States, which pissed off Vanderbilt, of course. And all these guys, Vanderbilt, Tom Scott, Andrew Carnegie, Nelson Rockefeller, others, Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel, they began to hire teams of lobbyists. Now, lobbying wasn't brand new at this point, but boy, it was new in many ways. What's happening in the culture and the society and the economy is the separation from workers from ownership. And that's ultimately a fundamentally cultural thing. And the West, of course, has so much to do with this. The West is going to have a lot to do with these scandals of the Grant years, too. But across the West, the federal government in the 1870s pursued a policy of what they like to call containment of Native Americans. That's a nice word for destruction, and in some areas, genocide. In California, where white farmers and ranchers, the numbers of them were growing in leaps and bounds, white farmers and ranchers sometimes forced American Indians into captive labor, in effect, slave labor. Some civilians practiced what became known in California as Indian hunting. And by 1880, after 30 years of this on-again, off-again, just vigilante violence, an estimated 4,500 California Native Americans had been killed. In Texas, Mexicans and other mixed race, we would call Hispanics, were deemed deemed lazy, inferior, under all kinds of racial stereotypes and subjected to all kinds of new discriminatory laws. A unique Texas Jim Crow began for Mexican Americans before most of the Jim Crow laws of the South were actually written. In California, Chinese immigrants were also the object of brutal violence. This was a violent era. We've talked about the Klan in the South. The violence in the West was different, but not much different. Many whites were glad to have the so-called coolie laborers by the thousands to build railroads and all kinds of other infrastructure in mining. They built these railroads across the Rocky Mountains, for God's sake. But when they started to move into the western cities, that's where all the trouble began. There were anti-coolie clubs run often by businessmen. California in the 1870s, still during Reconstruction, passed laws that just fanned the flames of anti-Chinese and particular racism. In 1879, the California Constitution denied the Chinese exclusively the right to vote. The final Federal Chinese Exclusion Act came just 3 years later from the Federal Congress, attempting to exclude all Chinese immigration to the United States, something that could not be stopped, but they passed a law to try to do it anyway. So the north-south axis of Reconstruction is where most of the story is told, and for good reason. But there's also this east-west, as America keeps moving west, this volatile east-west axis of whatever the reconstructing of America out of its Civil War would be over time. It's a tortured Reconstruction in the West. Now, and of course, the United States tried to have, and by the way, I'm playing with dates here that just to make you think. I mean, when did Reconstruction end? Has it? I can make an aggressive argument, and I may after Thanksgiving break, that it has not ended, and point to numerous aspects of the legacies of Reconstruction. But enough of that for the moment. The United States, though, has this Centennial coming up, and not the one we're going to face, which is the 250th. But boy, it's hard not to think about our 250th coming up year after next when you look back at what happened in the U.S. Centennial in 1876. They put on this massive Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Back to Sitting Bull in a moment. This is just one of the thousands of images of the Great Fair, the Great Centennial Exposition, the theme of which was, no surprise, technology and machines. Because America was becoming this place now, changing every day. We can relate to that. By one new piece of technology after another, one new thing that can help you do this or make you do that, or ruin your brain cells with social media or whatever. The Centennial was to be America's show for the world about the future. 9 years after the end of the Civil War. 11 years. At the Great Philadelphia Exposition, approximately 10 million people attended it from late spring 76 to September 76. That is 1/4 of the U.S. population. Imagine something today that 1/4 of us would all attend physically. There were no websites, nothing interactive. You had to go. And God, did people go. When they got there, they saw fantastic things. A wax replica of Cleopatra. How could you? They saw the first form of a telephone, a typewriter. This has been around a while, but they were getting faster. Packaged yeast. Now, that's not sexy and exciting, but that's how you get canned goods sent all over the country now. And something called an internal combustion engine. Damn. It's this little engine you can put on the front of a carriage, and it moves it. Good God. They could see the coreless steam engine, all 700 tons and 40 feet high of it. And they still have that, by the way, at the Smithsonian, now in Washington. You can see some remnants of the 1876 Exposition at the Smithsonian. It's amazing. The Machines, technology of all kinds. This was a great kind of national self-congratulation about ingenuity, and not without reason. The patent office couldn't put out the patents fast enough. I was just at a board meeting last week for the National Portrait Gallery. For some reason, they invited me to be on their board. I'm not an art historian, but there I am. And you may know this, the National Portrait Gallery, a magnificent building, is the old patent office. And you can still see the structures inside. It was the 19th century patent office, where thousands of careers were made by getting a patent on something. Oh, and by the way, they had something there too, a floor covering called linoleum. Whoa. You know, all right. No, I'm not going to ask for show of hands. How many of you grew up with a linoleum kitchen floor? You know, and remember how it would crack a little bit and come up at the edges? Yeah. And isn't it unhealthy now? I don't know. The trouble was, out in American society, there was one labor strike happening after another. They had all these pavilions showing American textiles, which were a marvel to the world, where the very factories making them were often on strike back home. There was a women's pavilion, large, popular apparently. It housed collections of needlework, weaving, and demonstrations of power looms. Women's place in this exposition, and therefore American society, was utterly apolitical. There was absolutely not a word mentioned in the exposition about women's suffrage. And a lot of protests were organized about that. For black people, no exhibits. 4 million people freed from slavery 11 years ago. You don't go there. You want a unified national exposition. So what did they do? They created, none of this is terribly surprising when you look deep into that cultural moment. They created something called the Southern Restaurant, which according to the guidebooks featured, quote, a band of old-time plantation darkies performing their songs. It's a very popular sight. Doo-dah, doo-dah. They had cotton competitions. And these giant bales of cotton were brought to Washington, and they competed for the biggest bales of cotton. And the grand prize was won by a black man named Benjamin Montgomery from Mississippi. Hooray. He beat out all the cotton bales from Brazil, Egypt, and the Fiji Islands. American Indians were represented at the Great Exposition, but almost exclusively portrayed as a people of the past, a vanishing people, important in American history to a degree, but now rendered largely harmless, primitive, noble savages. But in July, on almost exactly the 4th of July, some real Indians out west rudely interrupted the celebration when the news came over the wires that George Armstrong Custer and his cavalry had been defeated, indeed wiped out, by the Oglala Sioux under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And people wondered, what does this mean? If they'd been reading the newspapers, they knew that Custer's army and others with him had been chasing the Sioux for actually months, chasing them further and further west until they encountered this, some say, the largest encampment of Plains Indians ever assembled along the Little Bighorn. That victory, as you probably know, was a Pyrrhic victory for the Native Americans. They wiped out Custer and his band. On that one day, in 2 hours, they killed over 200 of Custer's cavalry. But it would be a Pyrrhic victory because the United States would now move troops in much, much larger numbers out there to the Dakotas and especially Montana to either wipe out the Great Plains tribes or move them now to reservations. The great theme of the Centennial Exposition that 10 million Americans physically saw and read about every day was the reconciliation of the country. Reconciliation around what they had in common, or they hoped they had in common. Now, before we dive into the election, that's Sitting Bull, by the way, a stunning photograph. Before we dive right into this disputed election and show what happened, let me just say a word about the backdrop here of the scandals that had rocked Grant's administration from the first term into the second term and almost right up to, right up to 1876. The first, the gold scandal. Seems like wherever gold is involved, something goes awry. It was an attempt by James Fisk in New York City to corner the national market on gold. How do you do that? You try to buy up all the gold in New York City, and then you plan to find a way to force bankers, through bribes and everything you can do, to force bankers and businessmen to buy gold only from you at inflated prices. Then you start working on the federal government, by whatever means possible, to get the federal government to release its gold and sell it to you at the prices you determine. It's amazing. Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, the two guys running this scheme, made approximately $11 million in 3 weeks. Now today, I don't know, what is that, $500 million? And pretty soon they're getting everybody to buy gold from them at inflated prices. This was an attempt to corner the gold market. It worked for a while. It worked in part because President Grant's brother-in-law, never appoint your brother-in-law to anything, Abel Corbin, went out and started assuring everybody and promising the plotters that he could influence Grant and get the Grant administration to release all the federal gold. Then the Secretary of the Treasury, one George Boutwell, authorized the Treasury. And Grant will claim he knew nothing of this over time, and he may not have. He was pretty hapless about some of this stuff. But I think almost all of his biographies have let him off the hook a bit. He's still a president. But George Boutwell authorized the Treasury Department to sell gold to businessmen and to pay their debts. Now, this scandal finally broke open after about a year. It was stopped, as it were. No one was ever prosecuted, especially the people who made fortunes off this. But it did lead in Congress to the efforts for a civil service reform bill, which was supposed to be some rules about just who gets hired in federal positions. No comment about where we're at today. Then there was the whiskey ring. Oh man, this one was really clever. And fortunes were made in this one too. In the early 1870s, it began in St. Louis, it appears. Nothing against St. Louis, but distilleries banded together, distilleries of whiskey, banded together to cheat the U.S. government out of all of its excise taxes. Whiskey has an excise tax. It was one of the few kinds of real taxes the federal government collected, and they collected a lot of it. You know, vice tax. Many officials in the Treasury Department were involved, including the chief clerk, the man who kept the books. Get him involved, the guy who keeps the books. Then there was a man named Orville Babcock, the president's private secretary, was implicated, charged, and acquitted. But here was the scheme. Branch offices of the federal government's excise tax system were in on the scheme. Milwaukee, Peoria, New Orleans, Chicago, Cincinnati, Washington, Detroit, and many, many other cities. Whoever ran that office was in on the game. And millions of dollars, nobody even knows how many millions, in liquor revenue was lost to the Treasury Department. It never got to the Treasury Department. It went into the hands, the pockets of people running the Treasury Department's system. It broke open in 1875. The scandal was finally broken open. A lot of people were arrested in this. I mean, this was just outright fraud and graft. I mean, inside, outside, to just take millions of revenue into a relatively, the pockets of a relatively few people. Trials were held. The estimate is that approximately $40 to $50 million in the 1870s now was stolen over about a 4.5-year period from the federal coffers. There was an investigation. It rocked Grant's second administration, and it is one of the reasons he didn't run again, although there was a lot of pressure on him to run again. 152 people were indicted in the liquor business, 86 indicted in the federal government, 110 convicted. Most got short terms or suspended sentences. Nobody ever paid back what they stole. And last but not least, Crédit Mobile was simply the production wing of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Pennsylvania, that was technically known as the Pennsylvania Fiscal Agency, chartered in 1859, but it became the manufacturing wing of the Pacific Railroad Company, or the first Transcontinental Railroad. It did the construction, and all the money to do it came from the federal government. There's a reason we sometimes do have suspicion of federal grants. We now have all kinds of regulations from years and years and years of these problems. But what basically happened was the Union Pacific had a charter from the federal government to build that first transcontinental, and they will build it. But for each mile of track built, the Union Pacific was to receive 10 sections of public land, and from $16,000 to $48,000 for each section of that land, depending on how difficult the terrain was. And by the way, that money was far more than they needed to build the track. The Union Pacific arranged the construction contracts with its own firm, they called Crédit Mobile, and they made enormous, wild, crazy profits. And the stock of Crédit Mobile skyrocketed until this scheme was broken open. Again, Grant is going to kind of skim his way through this, but a whole bunch of people in the Grant administration were involved in this. It was all exposed by about 1872, the year of his re-election, and there were actually very few. There were some prosecutions, but not much. It left all these grant scandals, and there are at least two more, left the electorate with a sense that the government is corrupt. Politics is corrupt, because sometimes it just was. It was the age of spoilsmen, as Richard Hofstadter once put it. Now, to this election, and it's the first election Americans have had now since the war when both parties, it was not yet the case in '72. It's before the panic, before the Republicans lost the Congress in 1874, which we've talked about before. It's the first time both national parties faced each other with a relative equality in terms of states, in terms of membership, in terms of money and power. It's going to lead to this compromise we call the Compromise of 1877, but here was the election and its trouble, or its problem. This is going to be now an election. You know, if Reconstruction was a referendum on the meaning of the war, the election of 1876 is now a referendum on the meaning of Reconstruction and whether it will last. It's also a referendum on the meaning of reunion itself. Is the reunion in North and South what most Americans want now? And they're going to say so at the ballot box, or no? It's following these scandals, of course. At this point, on the eve of the '76 election, all but 3 of the ex-Confederate states are back under the control of the Democratic Party. The so-called Southern redemption has occurred in all but 3: Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina. In other words, would this be an election that would confirm Southern redemption, white supremacy, the white South, taking back control, home rule, and so on, so on, so on, and the ultimate obliteration of black rights, and the end to the vision of Reconstruction? Or would it be a national reunion, some kind of new unity based on something? The Democrats are going to run this fellow, Samuel J. Tilden, who was the governor of New York. He was one of the richest men in America. He was a millionaire lawyer. Kind of a nervous, boyish-faced guy with a lot of money. He had a reputation for going after corruption. He's going to run against the Republicans now after the grant scandals. Good position to have. And the Democrats are crying, reform, reform, reform. We need civil service reform. They're also running yet again another white supremacist campaign, still painting these Republicans as the party of Reconstruction, the party of black equality and miscegenation and all the rest. For the Republicans, they're going to run a Civil War hero. They always did for the rest of the 19th century. Rutherford B. Hayes. He's actually a fascinating, he's a footnote in history too often, because he gets elected in this disputed election. He probably didn't win the popular vote. He's just another guy from Ohio. Sorry. You know the saying. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some just come from Ohio. No offense, but we've had a lot of presidents from Ohio. Anyway, Henry Adams, the acerbic satirist in Henry Adams, unfairly, I think, called Rutherford Hayes, called him a, quote, third-rate nonentity whose recommendation was that he was obnoxious to no one. Okay, thank you very much. Now, Hayes's issue here was, how do you hold this Republican coalition still together when it is not holding together? How do you get any votes in the South now and still hold on to New England? How do you remain and in his instincts, he was very much still the candidate of black rights. He was all over that. He was a wounded Civil War veteran. But he started to make speeches about states' rights and the necessity of unity and healing and giving the South back some control of their own society. Black male suffrage had to be maybe reconsidered a bit. He's trying to moderate, because he wants to get elected. And in effect, he signaled that if you elect Hayes, you might begin to see the slow end of federal enforcement of anything called Reconstruction. Now, that wasn't certain, but he would say things like, the old sectional bitterness is dying out and rapidly never to revive. Really? I mean, the bloody shirt was as bloody as ever in this election, with Republicans getting up on stumps. Hayes didn't do this, but others did, getting up on stumps and saying, the men who killed my son are Democrats. The men who broke up the Union with secession are Democrats. The people lynching people in the South are Democrats. You think we're polarized? Go look at the 1876 election. And Hayes already signaled that if elected, he was going to have some kind of version of what he called a let alone policy. Let the South now alone to a degree. He knows the Northern populace is tired of Reconstruction, tired of all the Southern problem, the Negro problem. He was a man, though. I mean, he really was a man of great education, intelligence, extraordinary optimism, patriotism, a war veteran. He even had good political instincts. He was very good at saying what audiences wanted to hear. But he had this kind of naive faith, it turns out anyway, a naive faith that there was sufficient goodwill in Americans that they were about now the business of healing themselves from this war. You know, you can be wrong about something and still have ideals that are worth having. He thought that what was really about to come, if he could get elected, was a reconciliation, a realignment, and what he kept calling pacification. The whole country was going to get pacified. He wanted, he said, the sectional line between North and South erased. That was going to take a long time in our history, and it's not clear we ever have, totally. Now, it's a disputed election, and I'll leave you here hanging in the balance, maybe. It's an amazing election because you got 3 states not yet redeemed by the Southern Democrats, right? The voting returns. Well, let's just put it this way. Tilden carried all of the solid South, except Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. The 3 states still not yet fully under Democratic Party control. And in those states, the election returns will never fully be known. There was a lot of violence, a lot of intimidation. Republicans are going to claim we won those states because there were so many black voters, prohibited from voting, and there were, by violence, all kinds of intimidation. Democrats are going to say, nonsense. Democratic Party has revived in those states, just like it has in Georgia, just like it has in Mississippi, just like it has everywhere else. Hayes carries almost all of the North, and on election night, or actually the next day, because of the telegraph now, and the returns are coming in, Hayes' campaign manager came to him that next morning and said, "Sir, it looks like we've lost." Because Tilden, without even those 3 states counted yet, has 185 electoral votes. See the number I put up here somewhere? Don't I have it up here somewhere? Yeah. Said, sir, Tilden already has 184 and he only needs 185. So if we've even lost one of those states, sir, I'm afraid it's over. And Hayes was preparing a concession speech, and then somebody else walked in and said, no, 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 no. There are 19 electoral votes in those 3 states, and we're going to win them. How are we going to win them? We're going to win them. Because if we win them, we win 185 to 184. Sir, don't concede. And he didn't. There was plenty of corruption in those states, too. As one wag, actually a historian wag once put it, the Democrats stole the election first and the Republicans kind of stole it back. Hence the disputed election of 1876. And was it ever? Oops, sorry about that. Leave you here. Tilden probably won the popular vote. If you look this up, Google this, you'll find an official count of 4,284,000 to 4,036,000. So Tilden won by some 250,000 votes in the official count popular vote. But as we all know, that's not what counts. So because this election was so disputed and undecided, it's thrown into the House of Representatives. This is the real thing. They actually used the Constitution here, sort of, properly. They established an electoral commission. Amazing. 15 members, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 5 Supreme Court justices. Now that seems perfectly fair, doesn't it? All those Supreme Court justices had been appointed by Republican presidents. Guess how the vote came out? Their job was to assess the returns from those 3 disputed states in the winter, actually way into February of 1877. The country did not know who had won this election from Election Day in November until almost the first week of March, when the inauguration was supposed to occur. That electoral commission assessed the returns as best they could understand them, and they voted 8-7 that Hayes had won. The Democrats threatened a filibuster in both houses. They not only threatened it, they did it. Some threatened disunion again and civil war. There were all kinds of wild rumors about militias marching all over the South and soon to march on Washington. And Ulysses Grant, the outgoing president now, quietly began to rebuild defenses around Washington, D.C. And then Democrats and Republicans went to the Wormley Hotel, which is still there in Washington, and they will show you the room where this famous meeting occurred at the Wormley. Republicans and Democrats got together, and by the way, at that meeting were 5 Ohio Republicans and 4 Southern Democrats. Oh, and they also invited Tom Scott, the railroad king. And they made a deal. This was a classic smoke-filled room deal to settle the 1876 election. One thing they agreed upon is Hayes would become president. Democrats are going to have to swallow this, but here's what they're going to get. They would get home rule for Louisiana and South Carolina as fast as Republicans could help them get it. There would be a removal of whatever remaining troops there were in the South. Now, this is the great myth of the 1877 Compromise. If you look this up, textbook, not in textbook I helped write, but you always hear, oh, the Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction because it pulled the troops out of the South. There were so few federal troops left anywhere in the South, and they were all in little coastal forts, they weren't even relevant anymore. But nevertheless, they made this promise, no more federal troops in the South. Third, they promised a federal subsidy for the Western Pacific Railroad with a southern terminus. You're going to get a railroad, baby. 4, they promised 1 or 2 cabinet positions in Hayes's cabinet. 5, the Democrats agreed to help make James Garfield Speaker of the House, Ohioan. And lastly, the Democrats agreed to stop their filibuster, no more marching militia around, accept the count of the commissioners, and Hayes would be peacefully inaugurated. They also knew what they were doing. They were crushing now, slowly if not surely, any attempts at enforcement of black civil and political rights. On March 3, Rutherford Hayes was privately inaugurated inside the White House. They did not hold it outdoors. They did not hold it at the Capitol. They were afraid of violence. It was more a treaty than it was an election. I'll leave you here. Right after this, actually a couple years after this, Frederick Douglass gave a speech. He didn't like this compromise. You couldn't love it. You couldn't like it. And in a speech he delivered that was full of pain, he said, you know, we may keep debating civil service reform, taxes, tariffs, disputes over labor and capital, but our Lazarus is not dead. He only sleeps. And what is Douglass drawing off there? The great revolutionary story in the Bible. Actually, Lazarus appears twice in the Bible, but it's that great, incredibly revolutionary notion that Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead. He says, our Lazarus is not dead. He's just sleeping. It's kind of Douglass's attempt, as usual, to say, if you lose, don't quit.